Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected places. When all hope seems lost, that's when life shows us what truly matters. Luke Donovan had been riding the Montana Territory for 15 years, carrying nothing but his saddle, his rifle, and a heart grown cold from too many goodbyes. By the banks of the Yellowstone River, as twilight painted the sky purple, he discovered 5 wolves, barely clinging to life. Starved, wounded, and abandoned by their own kind, they lay motionless in the tall grass like forgotten prayers. Any sensible man would have ridden on. Wolves were nothing but trouble in cattle country, but something in their eyes spoke to the emptiness Luke had carried for so long. Against all reason, he chose to stay. He shared his meager rations, tended their wounds, and waited through the long nights as they slowly returned from death's doorstep. What began as simple kindness became something deeper than Luke ever imagined possible. But when word spread that the government planned to eliminate every wolf in the territory, would Luke's newfound family become his greatest blessing or his most heartbreaking burden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Luke Donovan pulled the worn leather journal from his saddlebag and placed it beside him on the riverbank. The book had traveled with him for 15 years, its pages filled with the names of towns he'd passed through, jobs he'd worked, and people he'd left behind. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt compelled to write again. The journal's leather cover bore the scars of countless miles, scratches from thorny brush, water stains from river crossings, and the deep creases that came from being gripped too tightly during lonely nights. Inside, his father's silver pocket watch rested between the pages, its hands frozen at 3:17, the exact moment his world had changed forever. The watch hadn't ticked since the day cholera took his parents and younger sister, leaving him to lose the family ranch to creditors who showed no mercy to a 17-year-old boy's grief. The 5 wolves before him stirred slightly as evening shadows deepened. Luke had stumbled upon them purely by chance, following a game trail down to the water's edge where his horse could drink. At first, he'd mistaken them for fallen logs or scattered rocks. Only when one lifted its head with tremendous effort did he realize what lay before him. They were magnificent creatures, even in their weakened state. The largest, a grey male with silver streaks through his coat, appeared to be the pack leader. His breathing was shallow but steady, and when Luke approached, the wolf's amber eyes tracked his movement with weary intelligence. 2 smaller wolves, likely females, lay pressed against each other for warmth. Their ribs showed clearly through matted fur, and their tongues lolled from parched mouths. The 4th wolf, smaller than the rest and darker in coloring, bore the evidence of some violent encounter. Deep gashes ran along its flanks, partially healed but still seeping. Luke recognized the mark's bear claws, probably from a territorial dispute over a kill. The 5th wolf, positioned slightly apart from the others, was the smallest of all. Little more than a large pup, it had the oversized paws and ears that promised growth it might never achieve. Luke knelt beside them, studying their condition with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years tending livestock. These wolves were days, perhaps hours, from death. Starvation had hollowed their frames, and dehydration had turned their noses dry and cracked. Whatever had driven them to this state, disease, injury, or abandonment by their pack, they were now beyond the point where wild animals typically recover on their own. In cattle country, the decision would be simple. Wolves were predators, threats to livestock and livelihoods. Any rancher worth his salt would put them out of their misery and count it as a service to the community. Luke's own rifle rested in its scabbard, loaded and ready. A few quick shots would end their suffering and eliminate future problems. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the way the pack leader's eyes seemed to hold a spark of dignity even in defeat. Perhaps it was the memory of his own darkest moments, when he'd felt abandoned and forgotten by the world. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition of fellow outcasts who'd found themselves with nowhere else to go. The nearest settlement, Millfield, lay 20 miles to the east. Luke had ridden through it twice in the past month, picking up supplies and odd jobs. The town served a collection of cattle ranches and mining claims scattered across this stretch of Montana territory. Sheriff Tom Bradley kept order with a firm hand and little tolerance for anything that threatened the economic stability his constituents depended on. Wolves definitely fell into that category. Luke opened his journal and began to write by the dying light. His handwriting, once careful and precise, had grown rushed and practical over the years of constant travel. The entry was brief. Found 5 wolves dying by Yellowstone River. Don't know why I'm staying. Don't know what I can do for them. But a man gets tired of walking away from everything. The temperature was already dropping. Montana nights in late September could be brutal, and Luke knew the wolves wouldn't survive another cold snap in their weakened condition. He'd brought enough supplies for 3 days of solitary travel, including a small bag of jerked beef, hardtack, and grain for his horse. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to make a difference. He started by bringing water. Using his hat as a makeshift bowl, he carried river water to each wolf, letting drops fall on their tongues and noses. The pack leader drank weakly but gratefully. The others were slower to respond, but eventually all 5 managed to take some water. Next came the more difficult decision about food. Luke's jerked beef was precious, his only protein, until he reached the next town. But the wolves needed meat more than he needed security. He tore the dried beef into small pieces, soaking them in river water to make them easier for the weakened animals to digest. The pack leader was the first to eat, accepting the softened meat with surprising gentleness. The others followed his lead, though the smallest wolf needed encouragement to take any nourishment at all. Luke found himself speaking softly to them as he worked, using the same calm tones he'd once used with injured horses and cattle. "Easy now," he murmured to the wounded dark wolf as he cleaned its injuries with water and strips torn from his spare shirt. "I know it hurts, but infection's going to hurt worse if we don't get this clean." As full darkness settled over the river, Luke built a small fire. The light would help him monitor the wolves through the night, and the warmth might help their recovery. He positioned himself where he could watch all 5 animals and still have access to the water. The pack leader lifted his head as the fire caught, studying Luke with renewed interest. There was something almost human in the way the wolf seemed to assess this unexpected benefactor. Luke met the animal's gaze steadily, neither challenging nor submissive, simply acknowledging a fellow survivor. "I don't know what happened to your pack," Luke said quietly, settling back against his saddle. "But I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to keep going when there doesn't seem to be much point." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. The others had settled into what appeared to be more comfortable positions, no longer the lifeless forms Luke had first discovered. It was a small improvement, but improvement nonetheless. Luke took out his father's pocket watch, running his thumb over the scratched silver surface. For 15 years, he'd carried it as a reminder of everything he'd lost. Tonight, surrounded by these dying creatures who'd somehow found the will to accept help from an unlikely source, he wondered if it might represent something else entirely. The decision to stay wasn't rational. Luke had learned to be practical above all else, to avoid emotional attachments that led to disappointment and loss. These wolves were wild animals with no guarantee of survival, no matter what care he provided. They belonged to a world that was rapidly disappearing as civilization pushed westward, bringing cattle ranches and mining operations that had no tolerance for predators. But rationality had kept him alive and traveling for 15 years without forming meaningful connections with anyone or anything. It had protected him from loss, but had also insulated him from purpose. As he watched the wolves breathe more steadily in the firelight, Luke realized he'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. The smallest wolf, the one he'd mentally dubbed the pup, opened its eyes and looked directly at him. The animal's gaze was different from the pack leader's, less wary, more curious. It was as if the young wolf was seeing something in Luke that even Luke himself hadn't recognized. Luke pulled a blanket from his bedroll and carefully covered the pup, tucking the edges around its thin frame. The gesture was gentle, paternal in a way that surprised him with its naturalness. He hadn't taken care of anything vulnerable in more years than he could count. As the fire settled into steady coals and the sounds of the night grew around them, Luke made a conscious decision to stop looking backward. His journal had been a record of departure towns left, jobs finished, connections severed. But perhaps it could become something else. Perhaps it could become a record of arrival. He opened the leather-bound book one more time before sleep and wrote a single additional line. Going to try to save them. Don't know if I can, but going to try. The pack leader's breathing had deepened into what Luke recognized as genuine sleep rather than the shallow unconsciousness of approaching death. It was a small sign, but in Luke's experience, small signs were often the most reliable indicators of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The wolves would need more food, continued care, and protection from both the elements and any humans who might discover them. Luke would need to make decisions about how long he could afford to stay and what he was willing to risk for creatures he'd known less than a day. But tonight, beside the Yellowstone River with 5 wolves breathing steadily in the firelight, Luke Donovan felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years of wandering. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Dawn came slowly to the river, painting the water gold and orange as Luke stirred the dying embers of his fire. The wolves were all breathing, which was more than he'd dared hope for through the long night. The pack leader had even lifted his head at the sound of Luke's movement, watching with alert amber eyes as the man prepared for another day of uncertainty. Luke's stomach growled, reminding him that he'd given most of his food to his unexpected patients. He still had hardtack and a small portion of jerked beef, but at this rate, his supplies wouldn't last another day. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 15 years of solitary travel, whispered that he'd done enough. He'd given the wolves a fighting chance. Anything more was foolishness. But as he knelt beside the river to wash his face, Luke found himself studying a piece of driftwood that had caught against the bank. The river had worn it smooth, carved it into something almost bowl-like in shape. Without fully understanding why, he picked it up and began working at it with his knife, carving away the rough edges and deepening the natural depression. The work was meditative, requiring just enough concentration to quiet the doubts that kept surfacing in his mind. Luke hadn't carved wood since he was a boy, when his father had taught him to whittle during long winter evenings at the ranch. His hands remembered the motions, the careful angle of the blade, the smooth strokes that followed the grain, the patience required to let the wood reveal its own shape. The pack leader watched this process with obvious interest, his head now resting alertly on his front paws rather than lying flat against the ground. The improvement was remarkable. Yesterday, the wolf had been barely conscious. This morning, there was intelligence and curiosity in his gaze. "You're wondering what I'm doing, aren't you?" Luke said quietly, continuing his carving. "Making you a proper bowl. Can't have you trying to drink out of my hat forever." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of Luke's voice. It was a small response, but it suggested engagement with the world around him rather than the resigned withdrawal Luke had witnessed the day before. As Luke worked, the other wolves began to stir. The 2 females lifted their heads, sniffing the morning air with what appeared to be renewed interest. The wounded dark wolf remained still, but had opened his eyes, tracking Luke's movements with wariness that seemed less fearful than cautious. Even the small pup managed to lift its head, though the effort clearly exhausted it. The carved bowl took shape under Luke's patient hands. It wasn't elegant function mattered more than form, but it was solid and smooth, large enough to hold a good amount of water or softened meat. When he finished, Luke carried it to the river and filled it, bringing it back to set before the pack leader. The wolf's response surprised him. Rather than drinking immediately, the animal sniffed the bowl thoroughly, then looked up at Luke with what could only be described as recognition. It was as if the wolf understood that this wasn't just another necessity provided by their unexpected caretaker, but something created specifically for them, with care and intention. Luke felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. When was the last time he'd made something for another living creature? When was the last time his actions had been motivated by something other than his own survival or convenience? The pack leader drank deeply from the carved bowl, then stepped back to allow the others access. Luke watched, fascinated, as a clear hierarchy emerged. The two females drank next, followed by the wounded dark wolf, and finally the pup. It was orderly, respectful, and spoke to social bonds that had survived even their desperate circumstances. As the wolves recovered their strength, Luke began to notice details he'd missed in yesterday's emergency. The pack leader bore old scars along his muzzle and shoulders, marks of experience and leadership earned through years of survival. The females, while smaller, had the lean muscle definition of experienced hunters. The wounded wolf's injuries were healing cleanly, suggesting recent trauma rather than chronic weakness. But it was the pup that concerned Luke most. The young wolf was thin beyond simple hunger, with the sunken flanks and dull coat that suggested longer-term malnutrition. Whatever had befallen this pack, the youngest member had suffered most. Luke made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He opened his saddlebags and removed his remaining food supplies, all of them. The jerked beef, the hardtack, even the small bag of oats he'd been saving for his horse. If he was going to help these wolves recover, he needed to commit fully to the effort. He softened the beef in river water and offered it to each wolf in turn, starting with the pup who needed nutrition most desperately. The young animal ate with touching gratitude, its tail actually attempting a weak wag as Luke stroked its head gently. "That's better," Luke murmured. "You're going to be all right. All of you are going to be all right." The words surprised him with their conviction. Luke had spent 15 years avoiding promises, especially to himself. Promises implied commitment, and commitment led to loss. But something about these wolves had bypassed his usual caution. They needed him in a way that was immediate and uncomplicated, and he found himself responding with a dedication that felt both foreign and natural. As the morning progressed, Luke noticed increased activity from his patients. The pack leader stood on shaky legs, testing his strength before settling back down. The females moved closer together, beginning to engage in the gentle grooming behaviors that indicated social bonding. Even the wounded dark wolf lifted his head to sniff the morning breeze, alert to scents and sounds that Luke's human senses couldn't detect. It was the distant sound of horses that broke the peaceful morning. Luke's head snapped up, instantly alert to danger. In this territory, riders usually meant trouble of one kind or another, cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, or worse. He quickly kicked dirt over the remains of his fire and positioned himself between the approaching sounds and the wolves. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses picking their way carefully down the slope toward the river. Luke recognized the lead rider immediately. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man whose weathered face and steady bearing commanded respect throughout the territory. The 2 men with him wore the dusty clothes of working cowboys, but their eyes had the hard look of men accustomed to violence. "Morning, Donovan," Sheriff Bradley called as they approached. "Heard you might be camped down here." Luke stood slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way so early?" Bradley's gaze moved past Luke to the wolves, taking in the scene with professional assessment. His expression hardened immediately. "Seems like I should be asking you that question. Those are wolves, Donovan." "Dying wolves," Luke replied calmly. "Found them yesterday evening. They're no threat to anyone." One of the cowboys, a lean man with a sun-weathered face and suspicious eyes, spat into the dirt. "Only good wolf is a dead wolf. We've got cattle to protect." "Jake's right," Bradley said, though his tone carried less hostility than his companions. You know the situation out here, Luke. Ranchers are already on edge about predators. Having a pack this close to grazing land. It's not a pack anymore, Luke interrupted. Look at them, Tom. They're barely alive. Whatever happened to them, they're finished as hunters. Bradley studied the wolves more carefully, noting their weakened condition and the obvious care Luke had been providing. What happened to them? Luke shrugged. Don't know for certain. Disease, maybe, or they got driven off their territory by a stronger pack. All I know is I found them dying. And you decided to play nursemaid to a bunch of predators? The second cowboy, younger than Jake but with the same hard eyes, shook his head in disgust. That's the damnedest thing I ever heard. Every man's got his reasons for what he does, Luke said quietly, but his tone carried a warning that made both cowboys shift in their saddles. Sheriff Bradley held up a hand to forestall further comments from his companions. Luke, I've known you for 3 years now. You're a good man, and I respect what you're trying to do here, but you've got to understand the position this puts me in. Luke nodded slowly. He did understand. Bradley had to balance the concerns of the ranchers who formed the economic backbone of his territory against his own sense of fairness. It wasn't an easy position. How long do you figure it'll take? Bradley asked, surprising everyone with the question. How long for what? For them to either recover or, Bradley paused, choosing his words carefully, for this situation to resolve itself naturally. Luke looked back at the wolves, considering. The pack leader was watching the exchange with obvious tension, sensing the threat these new humans represented. The others had pressed closer together, a defensive formation that spoke to survival instincts that remained strong despite their weakened condition. A week, maybe 2, Luke said finally. If they're going to make it, I'll know by then. Bradley nodded slowly. I can give you that long. But Luke, if they recover, they can't stay here. This territory can't support wolves, not with the cattle operations expanding. I understand. Jake leaned forward in his saddle, his face flushed with anger. Sheriff, you can't be serious about this. Those are wolves. Those are dying animals being cared for by a man who's doing what his conscience tells him is right. Bradley cut him off firmly. I won't fault a man for showing mercy, even if I don't fully understand it. The younger cowboy started to speak, but Bradley's look silenced him immediately. We've got other business to attend to, gentlemen. Let's move on. As the 3 men prepared to leave, Bradley turned back to Luke one final time. 2 weeks, Luke. After that, I'll have to listen to the ranchers. You understand? I understand. And Tom, thanks. Bradley touched the brim of his hat and led his companions back up the slope, leaving Luke alone with the wolves and the weight of a deadline he wasn't sure he could meet. The pack leader approached the carved bowl again, but this time his attention seemed focused on Luke rather than the water. The wolf's amber eyes held an intensity that made Luke wonder just how much the animal had understood about the conversation with the sheriff. 2 weeks. Luke said quietly, settling back down beside his charges. We've got 2 weeks to figure out what comes next. The wolf continued to regard him steadily, and Luke had the strangest sensation that they'd just entered into some kind of agreement, one that would test both of them in ways neither could yet imagine. By the 3rd day, the transformation in the wolves was remarkable. Luke had fashioned crude rope collars from spare cordage in his pack, not to restrain them, but to help him distinguish between them and track their individual progress. The collars seemed to comfort rather than confuse the animals, as if the gentle weight around their necks provided a tangible connection to their human caretaker. The pack leader, whom Luke had begun calling Storm for the silver-grey coloring that reminded him of approaching weather, had regained enough strength to stand and walk short distances. His movements were still careful, deliberate, but there was dignity in his bearing that spoke to natural authority restored. Storm wore a collar of dark brown rope that complemented his coat, and he seemed to understand that it marked him as special in some way. The two females had recovered their appetites with impressive speed. Luke named the larger one Dawn, for the way golden highlights in her fur caught the morning light. Her collar was woven from lighter rope, almost blonde in color. The smaller female became Ember, her reddish-brown coat suggesting banked coals that might flare to life at any moment. She wore rope dyed with berry juice to match her coloring. The wounded dark wolf presented more of a challenge. His injuries were healing, but slowly, and he remained wary of Luke's touch, even as he accepted food and water. Luke called him Shadow, not for any lack of substance, but for the way he seemed to observe everything while revealing little of himself. His black rope collar made him appear almost formal, dignified in his reserve. The youngest wolf had stolen Luke's heart completely. Despite being nearly full-grown, the animal retained a playful curiosity that reminded Luke of the ranch dogs from his childhood. This one he named Scout, for the way the young wolf would venture small distances from the group before hurrying back to report on whatever he'd discovered. Scout's collar was braided from 3 different colors of rope, giving him a festive appearance that matched his recovering spirits. It was Martha Henderson who discovered Luke's unusual camp on the 4th morning. He heard her approach long before she came into view. Martha had never mastered the art of moving quietly through wilderness. As the town's schoolteacher, she had little need for such skills, but her curiosity about the world around her often led her to explore places that made the more conservative townspeople shake their heads. "Luke Donovan, what in heaven's name are you doing out here?" Martha called as she guided her mare down the slope toward the river. Luke stood quickly, positioning himself between Martha and the wolves. He'd grown protective of his charges in ways that surprised him with their intensity. "Morning, Martha. Didn't expect to see you this far from town." Martha Henderson was 43 years old, a widow who'd moved to Montana Territory after her husband's death to make a fresh start teaching children on the frontier. She had intelligent brown eyes, graying hair that she wore in a practical bun, and the kind of forthright manner that made her both respected and occasionally feared by the parents of her students. "I was collecting specimens for my natural science lessons," she said, dismounting and securing her horse before Luke could suggest she might want to leave. "Plants and rocks for the children to study. But I heard from Tom Bradley that you were—" She stopped mid-sentence as she caught sight of the wolves. Luke tensed, ready to defend his charges if necessary, but Martha's reaction surprised him. Instead of fear or disgust, her expression showed pure fascination. "Are those wolves?" she asked, moving closer despite Luke's protective stance. "They are, and they're still recovering, so they need quiet." Martha ignored his implicit suggestion that she leave. Instead, she studied the animals with the same careful attention she brought to her teaching. "They're magnificent," she said softly. "I've never seen wolves this close before." Storm lifted his head at the sound of her voice, assessing this new human with the same careful attention he'd given Sheriff Bradley. But unlike his reaction to the sheriff's companions, Storm showed no signs of aggression or fear. If anything, he seemed curious about Martha's calm presence. "How long have you been caring for them?" Martha asked, settling onto a fallen log without invitation. Luke realized he was dealing with someone who wouldn't be easily dismissed. Martha Henderson had a reputation for persistence when something captured her interest, and she was clearly interested in his situation. 4 days now," he admitted. "Found them dying when I came down here to water my horse." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "And you decided to help them. Seemed like the right thing to do at the time." "It was the right thing to do." Martha's voice carried the same firm conviction she used when correcting her students. Any creature deserves a chance to survive if someone's willing to provide it. Luke felt something ease in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear those words from another human being. For 4 days, he'd been second-guessing his decision, wondering if he was being foolishly sentimental about animals that most people considered dangerous pests. "Tom Bradley thinks I'm wasting my time," Luke said, settling back down near the wolves. Tom Bradley is a good man, but he sees the world in terms of law and order, Martha replied. Sometimes the most important things we do exist outside those boundaries. Scout, the youngest wolf, had been watching Martha with obvious interest. As she spoke, he crept closer, his natural curiosity overcoming the pack's general wariness of strangers. Martha noticed the movement and remained perfectly still, allowing the young animal to approach at his own pace. "He's beautiful," she whispered, as Scout sniffed cautiously at her extended hand. "That's Scout," Luke found himself saying. "He's the adventurous one." Martha smiled at the name. "They all have names?" Luke felt heat rise in his cheeks. Naming the wolves made his attachment to them obvious in a way that simply caring for them didn't. "Helps me keep track of their individual needs," he said defensively. "Of course it does," Martha agreed, but her tone suggested she understood the deeper truth behind the names. Scout decided Martha was acceptable and settled beside her, close enough that she could stroke his head gently. The young wolf's tail began to wag, the first truly happy expression Luke had seen from any of his charges. "You know the government is planning to eliminate wolves from the territory," Martha said quietly, her hand continuing its gentle motion along Scout's head. Luke's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "There's been talk in town. Orders coming down from territorial headquarters about predator control. They're concerned about the expansion of cattle operations and the mining interests." Luke watched Storm, who had risen to his feet and was pacing restlessly near the water's edge. The pack leader seemed to sense tension in the conversation, even if he couldn't understand the words. "How long do we have?" Luke asked. "I don't know for certain." "But Luke," Martha turned to face him directly. "You can't keep them here indefinitely. Even if they recover completely, this territory isn't safe for wolves anymore." Luke had known this truth since Sheriff Bradley's visit, but hearing it stated so plainly by someone who clearly sympathized with his efforts made it feel more real and immediate. "Then what am I supposed to do with them?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. She said finally, "Remote areas where they might be safe, but it would mean leaving the territory entirely." The implications of her words settled over Luke like a heavy blanket. Leaving the territory meant abandoning the only area where he'd found steady work, the only place that had felt even remotely like home since losing his family's ranch. It meant starting over again, but this time with responsibilities that would make finding work infinitely more difficult. "You're thinking about it," Martha observed. Luke looked at his 5 charges, Storm maintaining his alert watch, Dawn and Ember resting companionably together, Shadow keeping his careful distance, and Scout happily accepting Martha's attention. In less than a week, these animals had become more important to him than his own comfort or security. "I don't know what I'm thinking," he admitted. Martha smiled at his honesty. "That's often when we're thinking most clearly." As the morning progressed, Martha proved to be surprisingly helpful with the wolves' care. She had steady hands and infinite patience, qualities that served her well in both teaching and animal care. More importantly, she seemed to understand intuitively what Luke was experiencing. "You know," she said as she helped him prepare the wolves' midday meal, "I came out here to collect specimens for my students, but I think I've found something much more valuable." "What's that?" "A reminder that compassion doesn't require justification. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply care for something that needs caring for." Luke felt that warmth in his chest again. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that emotional distance was strength. But sitting beside the Yellowstone River with 5 recovering wolves and a woman who understood why he couldn't abandon them, Luke began to wonder if he'd confused strength with fear. Scout had fallen asleep with his head on Martha's lap. Storm watched this development with apparent approval, as if Martha had passed some test that Luke hadn't even realized was being administered. "What happens when Sheriff Bradley's 2 weeks are up?" Luke asked. Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, Let's focus on helping them get strong enough to make whatever choice they need to make. As Martha prepared to leave that afternoon, she turned back to Luke with a serious expression. "I'll be back tomorrow. And Luke, you're doing something important here. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After Martha left, Luke sat with his journal as the evening shadows lengthened. The wolves had settled into their usual positions around the dying fire, but there was something different about their arrangement. They were closer to him now, as if Martha's acceptance had somehow validated his presence in their lives. Luke wrote, "Martha Henderson came by today. First person who didn't think I'd lost my mind for helping them. Makes me wonder what I've been so afraid of all these years. Maybe the real courage isn't in leaving, maybe it's in staying when something matters." Storm lifted his head as Luke closed the journal, regarding him with those intelligent amber eyes. In the firelight, the rope collar around the wolf's neck looked less like a human imposition and more like a bond freely accepted between two survivors who'd found each other when they needed it most. By the end of the first week, Luke had begun to understand that he was witnessing something remarkable. The wolves weren't just recovering their physical strength, they were rebuilding their social structure around his presence. It was Storm who first demonstrated this new dynamic by falling into step beside Luke's horse as he made short rides to gather firewood and check the surrounding area. Luke had been sketching a crude map in his journal, trying to understand the landscape from the wolves' perspective. He marked water sources, game trails, and territorial boundaries based on what he observed during these brief explorations. The wolves' behavior told him more about the land than years of casual travel ever had. Storm would lead him to specific locations, always purposefully, never randomly. The pack leader would stop at certain rocks, trees, or stream crossings and wait for Luke to notice whatever had caught his attention. Often it was sign of other animals, deer trails, bare scratches on tree trunks, or the remains of old kills that told stories about predator and prey relationships. Dawn and Ember had begun following these expeditions, though they maintained a respectful distance behind Storm and Luke. Their positions seemed calculated to provide both support for their leader and protection for the group. Shadow still held himself apart, but he watched everything with the intensity of someone gathering intelligence. Scout, as his name suggested, ranged more widely. The young wolf would disappear for hours at a time, always returning with news that only the other wolves could interpret. His explorations were adding detail to Luke's growing understanding of their territory. It was during one of these mapping expeditions that Luke made a discovery that changed everything. Following Storm along a ridge that offered commanding views of the Yellowstone River Valley, he came upon evidence of a much larger tragedy than he'd initially understood. Hidden in a rocky depression, partially concealed by wind-blown debris, Luke found the remains of other wolves. The bones were scattered and weathered, but there were too many for a single animal. As he examined the site more carefully, the story became clear. This had been the den site for a much larger pack, perhaps 15 or 20 animals. The bones included adults and pups, suggesting an entire family group had died here. Storm sat beside the remains with a dignity that spoke of mourning. The great wolf's posture was formal, respectful, as if he were paying homage to fallen comrades. When Dawn and Ember arrived, they took similar positions, forming a semicircle around the scattered bones. Even Shadow emerged from his usual distance to stand with the others. Luke felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't death from natural causes. The bones showed evidence of bullet wounds and deliberate destruction. Someone had systematically eliminated an entire wolf pack, leaving only the 5 survivors he'd found dying by the river. "Poison," Luke said quietly, recognizing the signs. Strychnine was a common method for eliminating predators, often laid out in tainted meat that would kill entire family groups. The few survivors would have been those lucky enough to avoid the poisoned bait, only to slowly starve without their pack's support structure. As Luke sketched the location into his map, adding notes about what he'd discovered, he began to understand the true scope of what was happening across the territory. This wasn't isolated predator control, it was systematic extermination. His 5 wolves weren't just recovering from illness or injury, they were the remnants of a deliberate massacre. The knowledge changed his perspective on everything. Sheriff Bradley's 2-week deadline wasn't just about managing local concerns, it was part of a larger campaign to eliminate wolves entirely from Montana territory. Luke's act of compassion had inadvertently put him in opposition to government policy. That evening, Martha returned as she'd promised, bringing with her a small basket of supplies and news from town. Luke told her about his discovery, watching her face grow grave as she understood the implications. "There have been meetings," she said quietly, settling beside the fire as the wolves arranged themselves in their familiar circle. "Ranchers, mining interests, territorial officials. They're calling it predator management, but the goal is elimination." Luke studied his crude map by firelight, tracing the territories he'd begun to understand through the wolves' guidance. "How much time do we really have?" "Not long. Tom Bradley's been under pressure to revoke his protection, even for your situation here." Scout had claimed his usual position next to Martha, but tonight his attention seemed focused on the darkness beyond their camp. All 5 wolves appeared more alert than usual, their ears pricked towards sounds Luke couldn't detect. "They know something's wrong," Martha observed. Luke nodded. "They've been different since we found the den site, more cautious." As if to confirm his words, Storm rose and padded to the edge of their firelight, staring into the night with obvious tension. His hackles weren't raised, but his entire body radiated alertness. "Riders," Luke said quietly, recognizing the wolf's warning signs. They came from 3 directions, their torches visible long before they reached the river camp. Luke counted at least a dozen men, too many for a casual visit. He stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle, before he remembered his recent modifications to the weapon. The lead rider was someone Luke didn't recognize, a tall man with a military bearing and expensive clothes that marked him as someone from outside the local community. Behind him rode Sheriff Bradley, his expression apologetic but determined. The rest were local ranchers and cowboys, men whose livelihoods depended on cattle that they believed wolves threatened. "Mr. Donovan," the stranger called as they approached. "I'm Colonel James Morrison, Territorial Administrator for Predator Control. I understand you've been harboring wolves on public land." Luke stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and his charges. "I've been caring for injured animals, Colonel. Nothing more." Morrison's gaze moved past Luke to the wolves, taking in their improved condition and the obvious care they'd received. "These animals represent a direct threat to the economic development of this territory. Under territorial authority, I'm ordering their immediate destruction." "These wolves are no threat to anyone," Martha said, rising to stand beside Luke. Her voice carried the same authority she used in her classroom, and several of the local men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "Mrs. Henderson," Sheriff Bradley said quietly, "this isn't a matter for civilian involvement." "It's exactly a matter for civilian involvement when we're discussing the needless killing of animals that pose no threat," Martha replied firmly. Colonel Morrison studied Martha with obvious irritation. "Madam, these are wild predators. They cannot be domesticated or controlled. Allowing them to recover simply postpones the inevitable problem they'll create for legitimate land use." Luke felt Storm's presence at his shoulder. The pack leader had moved to stand beside him, not aggressively, but with clear intention to support his human companion. The gesture wasn't lost on the assembled riders, several of whom reached for their weapons. "Easy," Sheriff Bradley said quickly, addressing both the men and the situation. "Nobody needs to do anything hasty here." But Luke could see in Morrison's expression that haste was exactly what the colonel had in mind. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an ultimatum, delivered with overwhelming force to prevent any possibility of resistance. "You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave the area," Morrison announced. "The animals will be destroyed immediately for the safety of the territory." "No," Luke said quietly. The simple word created a silence that stretched across the camp like a held breath. Even the wolves seemed to sense the significance of the moment. "I beg your pardon?" Morrison's voice carried the tone of a man unaccustomed to being contradicted. "I said no. These animals are under my protection. They haven't harmed anyone, and they won't harm anyone under my care." One of the ranchers, a man Luke recognized as Pete Jameson, spurred his horse forward. "Donovan, you can't protect a pack of wolves against a dozen armed men. Be reasonable." Luke's hand moved toward his rifle before he remembered it was no longer functional for the purpose these men intended. But Storm must have sensed his tension, because the wolf stepped forward, placing himself directly between Luke and the mounted men. The movement triggered an immediate response. 3 cowboys drew their weapons, but their horses began to dance nervously, sensing the wolves' presence and their riders' agitation. Storm held his position calmly, showing no aggression but making his protective intentions clear. "This is getting out of hand," Sheriff Bradley said, his voice tight with concern. "Colonel, perhaps we could discuss alternatives." "There are no alternatives," Morrison cut him off. "These animals are going to be destroyed. The only question is whether Mr. Donovan chooses to interfere with territorial authority." Luke looked at his 5 charges, Storm standing proudly beside him, Dawn and Ember watching from their protective positions, Shadow alert but ready to follow Storm's lead, and Scout pressed close to Martha's side. In the space of a week, these animals had become more important to him than his own safety. "Then you'll have to go through me first," Luke said. The words surprised him with their conviction. For 15 years, he'd avoided confrontation, avoided commitment, avoided anything that might lead to loss. But standing beside the Yellowstone River with 5 wolves who trusted him enough to put their lives in his hands, Luke Donovan discovered what he was willing to fight for. Colonel Morrison's expression hardened. "So be it. Sheriff Bradley, arrest this man for interfering with territorial operations." Bradley hesitated, his loyalty clearly torn between territorial authority and his respect for a man he'd known for 3 years. In that moment of hesitation, Martha stepped forward. "Gentlemen," she said in her most authoritative teacher's voice, "I believe you're making a mistake that will reflect poorly on all of you." Her unexpected intervention created another pause in the escalating confrontation, and Luke realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of his wolves, but the direction of his own life for years to come. The confrontation by the river ended not with violence, but with an unexpected reprieve. Martha Henderson's intervention had created enough confusion and delay for Sheriff Bradley to assert his local authority over Colonel Morrison's territorial mandate. The wolves would be allowed to remain for 72 more hours while the proper paperwork was sorted through channels. But Luke understood this was borrowed time, nothing more. As the riders departed into the darkness, Martha helped Luke tend to his shaken charges. The wolves had remained calm throughout the confrontation, but their alertness afterward suggested they understood how close they'd come to disaster. "We need to find them a safe place," Martha said as they settled around the fire, "somewhere beyond territorial jurisdiction." Luke nodded, studying his hand-drawn map by flickering light. "There are places, remote valleys in the high country where government agents don't travel. But getting there," he shook his head, "that's going to be the problem." It was Scout who provided the first clue to a solution. The young wolf had been missing since dawn, longer than his usual explorations. When he returned near midday, he was clearly agitated, pacing and whining in a way that drew attention from the entire pack. Storm interpreted his youngest pack member's distress immediately. The pack leader rose and began moving purposefully upstream, following Scout's trail back toward whatever had caused such alarm. Luke followed, Martha beside him, as the wolves led them toward their discovery. What they found was a testament to the systematic nature of the government's wolf elimination program. Hidden in a grove of cottonwoods, Luke discovered a camp that had been hastily abandoned. Scattered papers, government forms and supply lists told the story of an operation far larger than anything he'd imagined. The official telegram, crumpled and discarded near a dead fire, made everything clear. Territorial directive. 847B, all wolf populations Montana Territory to be eliminated by December 31, 1875. Systematic poisoning program authorized. Bounty payments doubled. Resistance to territorial authority will be met with appropriate force. Luke read the document twice, his hands trembling with anger. This wasn't about protecting cattle or managing predators. It was about clearing the land for economic development, regardless of the cost to native wildlife. December 31st, Martha said quietly. That's less than 3 months away. Luke folded the telegram and put it in his pocket. Physical evidence of the government's intentions might prove useful, though he wasn't sure how. More immediately, the abandoned camp provided supplies that would help with the wolves' continued recovery. He found medical supplies, including sulfur powder, that would help heal Shadow's lingering wounds. There were also detailed maps of the territory, marked with locations where poison had been deployed and areas scheduled for future treatments. The scope of the operation was staggering. "Look at this," Martha said, studying a supply manifest. "They're planning to poison every water source and game trail between here and the Canadian border." Luke examined the maps more carefully, cross-referencing them with his own crude sketches. There were patterns to the government's approach, systematic methods that revealed both the thoroughness of their planning and potential escape routes they hadn't considered. "Here," he said, pointing to a section of the map that showed mountainous terrain marked as impassable and no strategic value. "They're not planning to patrol these areas." Martha studied the indicated region. "That's because no one lives there. It's wilderness, Luke. No settlements, no supply routes, no support for anyone trying to survive there. Maybe that's exactly what we need." As they returned to camp with their findings, Luke began to formulate a plan that was both desperate and necessary. The high country Martha had identified was indeed wild and remote, but it was also precisely the kind of territory where wolves might establish a new range beyond government reach. The challenges were enormous. Luke would need to guide 5 recovering wolves across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, avoiding patrols and poisoned areas while keeping his charges alive and healthy. He had no guarantee that suitable habitat existed in the remote valleys, and winter was approaching fast. But as he watched Storm and the others respond to his presence with trust and loyalty, Luke realized he'd already made his decision. These wolves had become his responsibility in a way that transcended practical considerations. They needed protection, and he was perhaps the only person in the territory both willing and able to provide it. That evening, as Martha prepared to return to town for what might be the last time, she surprised Luke with an offer that changed everything. "I'm coming with you," she announced as she prepared to mount her horse. Luke stared at her. "Martha, that's impossible. I'm talking about disappearing into wilderness that might not even be survivable. You have a life in Millfield, responsibilities. I have a teaching position that I can resume anywhere there are children to teach," she interrupted. "And I have the conviction that some things matter more than personal comfort. This isn't a romantic adventure, Martha. This is survival in country that could kill us all." Martha's expression grew serious. "Luke, do you think I don't understand what you're facing? Do you think I haven't considered the risks?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he'd missed before. Martha Henderson wasn't just the town schoolteacher offering to help with a worthy cause. She was a woman who'd already proven her willingness to start over in difficult circumstances, someone who'd chosen frontier life over easier options back east. "Why?" he asked, simply. Martha was quiet for a long moment, watching Scout play gently with a stick near the fire. Because 15 years ago, I watched my husband die slowly from consumption while doctors told me there was nothing to be done. I learned then that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to refuse to accept that nothing can be done. Luke felt something shift in his understanding of both Martha and his own situation. He'd been thinking of his commitment to the wolves as an isolated act of compassion, but Martha saw it as part of something larger, a refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable. "You understand what we'd be giving up?" he asked. "I understand what we'd be choosing instead." That night, Luke opened his journal and began writing in earnest for the first time since finding the wolves. His entries had been brief, factual notations about their care and recovery. But tonight, he wrote about choices and consequences, about the difference between surviving and living. "Martha has offered to come with us into the high country," he wrote. "Don't know if it's courage or foolishness that makes someone willing to abandon everything for the sake of 5 wolves and a man she's known for barely a week, but I know I'm grateful for it. These animals have taught me something about loyalty that I'd forgotten. Maybe it's time I learned something about accepting it from my own kind." Storm lifted his head as Luke closed the journal, studying his human companion with those intelligent amber eyes. In the wolf's gaze, Luke saw something that reminded him of his father's pocket watch, not the frozen time it represented, but the potential for moments that mattered enough to be remembered forever. The telegram crackled as Luke shifted it in his pocket, a reminder of the forces arrayed against them. But sitting beside the Yellowstone River with 5 wolves who trusted him and a woman willing to share their uncertain future, Luke Donovan felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead in the mountains. The decision came to Luke in the quiet hours before dawn, as he watched his 5 companions sleeping peacefully around the dying embers of their fire. Storm's steady breathing, Scout's occasional dream whimpers, the gentle way Dawn and Ember curled together for warmth, these sounds had become more precious to him than his own heartbeat. Luke rose carefully and walked to where his rifle rested against a fallen log. The weapon had been his constant companion for 15 years, a tool that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. It was well-maintained, accurate, and deadly, everything a man needed to survive in unforgiving country. But as Luke lifted the rifle and felt its familiar weight, he realized it had also become a symbol of everything he was trying to leave behind. The government agents who would soon come for his wolves carried similar weapons. The ranchers who saw predators as nothing more than targets to be eliminated relied on guns like this one. Colonel Morrison's authority ultimately rested on the threat of organized violence. Luke examined his rifle's firing mechanism by the pale light of approaching dawn. It would be simple enough to damage it beyond repair. A few strategic blows with a rock would render the weapon useless. But that felt too destructive, too final. Instead, he began the more delicate work of permanent modification. Using his knife and a small file from his repair kit, Luke carefully damaged the firing pin, making it impossible for the rifle to discharge. He filed down the front sight until it was no longer accurate for distance shooting. The modifications were subtle but irreversible. The weapon would still appear functional to casual inspection, but it could never again be used to take a life. As he worked, Luke felt a strange sense of liberation. For 15 years, his identity had been tied to his ability to survive through self-reliance and, when necessary, violence. The rifle represented that philosophy, the belief that safety came from the ability to eliminate threats before they could eliminate you. But the wolves had taught him something different. They had survived their catastrophe not through violence but through trust in each other, and eventually, trust in him. They had shown him that strength could come from vulnerability, that survival might depend not on the ability to destroy, but on the willingness to protect. Martha arrived just as Luke finished his modifications, leading her horse and a pack mule laden with supplies. She took in the scene immediately, Luke's rifle propped uselessly against the log, the tools of modification scattered around his feet, the expression of grim determination on his face. "Second thoughts?" she asked quietly. No, Luke replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Just making sure I can't change my mind when things get difficult. Martha nodded approvingly. Smart. It's easier to maintain conviction when you've eliminated the alternatives. She had brought more than supplies. Martha had gathered intelligence. During her final day in Millfield, she'd spoken carefully with several townspeople, piecing together information about the government's timeline and the safest routes into the high country. Colonel Morrison is bringing in federal marshals, she reported, as they prepared the wolves for travel. The local situation has been classified as resistance to territorial authority. They're not just coming to eliminate wolves anymore, they're coming to make an example. Luke felt a chill of recognition. He'd seen what happened to people who became examples for federal authority. It usually involved public trials, substantial prison sentences, and the kind of notoriety that followed a man for the rest of his life. How long do we have? They're organizing in Miles City. 2 days, maybe 3, before they arrive with enough force to make resistance impossible. Luke looked at his 5 charges, assessing their readiness for the journey ahead. Storm had regained most of his strength and moved with something approaching his natural authority. Dawn and Ember appeared healthy and alert. Shadow's wounds had healed cleanly, though he remained cautious about human contact. Scout bounced with youthful energy that would serve him well on mountain trails. But could they travel fast enough and far enough to escape federal pursuit? And could Luke and Martha survive in wilderness that had defeated countless others? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Luke struggled with doubts about their chances, Storm approached and sat beside him, meeting his eyes with steady confidence. The pack leader's message was clear. They were ready to follow wherever he led them. "All right," Luke said, standing and shouldering his pack. "Let's see what's waiting for us in the mountains." The journey began before full daylight, following game trails that would keep them away from established roads and settlements. Luke led on horseback, while Martha followed with the pack mule. The wolves ranged around them in a loose formation that spoke to restored pack dynamics. Storm slightly ahead, and to one side, Dawn and Ember flanking their route, Shadow bringing up the rear, and Scout ranging more freely but always returning to check their progress. It was Scout who first demonstrated the wolves' ability to contribute to their mutual survival. The young wolf had been gone for nearly an hour when he returned in obvious agitation, leading the group toward a discovery that changed their understanding of the territory they were crossing. Hidden in a ravine, Scout had found evidence of recent cattle rustling, not the kind of casual theft that opportunistic drifters might attempt, but an organized operation involving dozens of animals. The tracks were fresh, the camp showed signs of recent occupation, and the men responsible were clearly still in the area. Luke studied the rustlers' trail with growing understanding. This wasn't just criminal activity, it was organized theft that would inevitably be blamed on wolf predation. The missing cattle would justify increased bounties and more aggressive elimination efforts, regardless of the actual predators responsible. "They're using the wolf scare to cover their operations," Martha observed, as she examined the evidence. Luke nodded grimly. "And every cow they steal makes it harder for any wolf to survive in this territory." But the discovery also presented an opportunity. If Luke could expose the real cause of the missing cattle, it might buy time for other wolves still hiding in the territory. It wouldn't save his 5 companions. They were too closely associated with his resistance to territorial authority, but it might prevent some of the systematic poisoning planned for the coming months. The decision to investigate further delayed their escape by valuable hours, but Luke felt compelled to gather evidence that might help other wolves survive. Using tracking skills learned from his father and refined through years of frontier life, he began documenting the rustlers' operation with the same careful attention he'd given to mapping wolf territories. What he discovered was larger and more organized than he'd expected. The rustling operation involved at least a dozen men with established supply lines and markets for stolen cattle. They were stealing selectively, taking animals from different ranches in patterns designed to suggest predator activity rather than human theft. More importantly, Luke found correspondence between the rustlers and territorial officials' letters that suggested coordination between the theft operation and the wolf elimination program. The rustlers were providing justification for federal intervention, while territorial authorities were ensuring that the real perpetrators remained above suspicion. "This goes all the way to the top," Martha said as she read one of the intercepted letters. "They're manufacturing a crisis to justify policies they wanted to implement anyway." Luke felt a surge of anger that had nothing to do with personal threats to his safety or his wolves' welfare. The systematic elimination of wolves was being justified by crimes committed by the very people implementing the elimination program. It was corruption on a scale that made individual violence seem almost innocent by comparison. But anger wouldn't help his wolves survive the journey ahead. Luke carefully documented what they'd discovered, then buried the evidence in a location he could find again if the opportunity arose to expose the conspiracy. For now, survival had to take precedence over justice. As they resumed their journey toward the high country, Luke's modified rifle felt lighter on his shoulder. He'd eliminated his ability to respond to threats with violence, but he'd gained something more valuable: clear understanding of what he was fighting for and why it mattered. The wolves sensed his renewed determination. Storm's pace became more confident, and even Shadow moved closer to the group, as if the pack leader's certainty had reassured them all about the rightness of their chosen path. Behind them, the valley that had been their temporary home disappeared into morning mist. Ahead lay mountains that promised either sanctuary or death, depending on their skill, luck, and the bonds that had formed between 5 wolves and 2 humans who'd decided that some things were worth any risk to protect. 3 days into their mountain journey, exhausted and low on supplies, Luke made the discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about his connection to the wolves. They had taken shelter in a shallow cave during a sudden storm, and while Martha tended a small fire, Luke explored the deeper recesses of their temporary refuge. His hand struck something hard, buried beneath years of accumulated debris. Working carefully by lamplight, Luke uncovered a small metal box, weathered but still intact. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture, he found a collection of items that made his heart stop. The faded daguerreotype showed a man who looked remarkably like Luke himself, the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same way of holding his shoulders that Luke recognized from mirrors. But the man in the photograph wasn't alone. Arranged around him in a composition that spoke of trust and companionship were 6 wolves, their poses natural and relaxed, as if they were accustomed to human contact. Luke's hands trembled as he turned the photograph over. In his father's distinctive handwriting, he read, "Thomas Donovan and the Yellowstone Pack, September 1847. May they find peace in the high country. Thomas Donovan." Luke's father, dead these 18 years, photographed with wolves in a pose that suggested deep familiarity and mutual respect. Luke had never known his father to have any connection with wolves. In fact, Thomas had been a cattle rancher, someone whose livelihood should have put him in direct conflict with predators. But the evidence was undeniable. Luke examined the other items in the box: his father's journal, written in the same careful script Luke remembered from childhood, and maps drawn with the kind of detail that came from extensive exploration. The journal entries told a story Luke had never heard, about a man who'd discovered that wolves and cattle could coexist if humans were willing to understand rather than simply eliminate. Found this den site today, Luke read from an entry dated August 1847. 6 wolves, starving from the government poisoning program. Couldn't ride away and leave them to die. Brought them meat, water, watched them recover their strength. They're not the enemies we've been told they are. Entry after entry documented Thomas Donovan's growing relationship with the wolf pack. He'd learned to read their communication signals, understand their territorial patterns, and work with them rather than against them. More remarkably, he'd discovered that wolves could actually help protect cattle from real threats: bears, mountain lions, and human rustlers who found wolf territories uncomfortable places to operate. "The ranchers think I'm crazy for tolerating wolves on my land," Thomas had written. "But my cattle losses are lower than anyone else's in the territory. The wolves keep the real predators away, and they're smart enough to know that killing my stock would end our arrangement." Luke continued reading, his understanding of his family's history completely rewritten by his father's words. Thomas Donovan hadn't just tolerated wolves, he'd formed a partnership with them that had lasted for years. The Yellowstone Pack had become part of the ranch's operations, living in the high country during summer and moving to lower elevations in winter, always maintaining territories that complemented rather than threatened cattle operations. But the journal's final entries revealed why Luke had never known about his father's relationship with wolves. Government pressure had intensified in the 1850s, making wolf partnerships illegal rather than simply unusual. Thomas had been forced to choose between his family's safety and his loyalty to the pack. "They're coming for the wolves tomorrow." Luke read from an entry dated just months before his father's death. "Federal marshals, with orders to eliminate every wolf in the territory. I've led the pack to the high country caves where they'll be safe, but I can't protect them anymore. Had to choose between my human family and my wolf family. Pray someday Luke will understand the choice I made." Luke closed the journal and looked up to find Martha watching him with concern. "What is it, my father?" Luke said quietly. He knew them, not these exact wolves, but their ancestors. He worked with them for years. Martha moved closer, studying the daguerreotype over Luke's shoulder. "That's remarkable. Look at the trust in their postures. That kind of relationship doesn't develop overnight." Luke examined the photograph more carefully, comparing the wolves in the image to his current companions. The resemblance was unmistakable. Storm had the same distinctive silver markings as the pack leader in his father's photograph. Dawn's golden highlights matched those of a female wolf positioned prominently in the composition. "These aren't just any wolves," Luke realized. "These are the descendants of my father's pack. They came to me because somehow they remember." The revelation reframed everything Luke had experienced since finding the dying wolves by the river. Their unusual willingness to accept human help, their rapid adaptation to his presence, the way they seemed to understand his intentions, it all made sense if they carried some inherited memory of humans who could be trusted. But it also meant that Luke's father had faced the same impossible choice that now confronted his son. Thomas Donovan had ultimately chosen his human family's safety over his loyalty to the wolves, leading them to remote sanctuary before returning to a conventional life that protected his wife and children from government retaliation. Luke studied the maps his father had drawn, noting marked locations for caves, water sources, and safe routes through the mountains. The detail was extraordinary. Thomas had clearly spent years exploring the high country, establishing refuges where wolves could survive beyond government reach. "He built a network," Luke said, tracing routes on the hand-drawn maps. "Look at this caves connected by game trails, water sources, areas where wolves could establish new territories without threatening human settlements." Martha examined the maps with her teacher's eye for detail. "These are incredibly thorough. Your father must have spent years developing these safe routes." Luke felt a mixture of pride and sorrow as he understood the full scope of his father's work. Thomas Donovan had created a sanctuary system for wolves, then been forced to abandon it to protect his human family. The network had remained unused for nearly 30 years, waiting for someone who could resume the work Thomas had been forced to abandon. But the discovery also raised troubling questions. If his father had successfully established wolf refuges in the 1840s, what had happened to them? Why were the descendants of his pack dying by the Yellowstone River instead of thriving in the sanctuary Thomas had created? The answer came from his father's final journal entries, written in increasingly hurried script as government pressure intensified. The wolf elimination program of the 1870s was far more systematic and ruthless than anything Thomas had faced. Federal resources, improved communications, and coordinated poisoning campaigns had systematically destroyed the refuges Thomas had established decades earlier. "The old safe places aren't safe anymore," Luke said, understanding the full scope of their challenge. "The government found them, eliminated the wolves that were using them." Martha studied the maps more carefully. "But the routes are still here. The geography hasn't changed. Maybe your father's network could be rebuilt." Luke looked at his 5 companions, resting peacefully around Martha's small fire. Storm's breathing was steady, confident, as if the great wolf somehow understood that they were following paths established by allies from generations past. The pack's trust in Luke's leadership made perfect sense. Now they were following inherited patterns of cooperation that had sustained their ancestors for decades. "They chose me," Luke said quietly. "Not randomly. They came to the place where my father used to meet with their ancestors. They were looking for help from the Donovan family." The weight of inherited responsibility settled on Luke's shoulders like a heavy cloak. His father had been forced to abandon the wolves to protect his human family. But Luke had no human family left to protect, only the 5 wolves who represented the last survivors of a partnership that had endured for nearly 30 years. As the storm outside their cave began to subside, Luke made a decision that felt both new and inevitable. He would not repeat his father's choice. He would not abandon the wolves to protect a conventional life that held no meaning for him. Instead, he would rebuild what Thomas Donovan had been forced to destroy, creating a new network of refuges where wolves could survive beyond government reach. "We're going to need more than just hiding places," Luke told Martha as he studied his father's maps. "We need to rebuild the whole system, safe routes, sustainable territories, maybe even other people willing to help." Martha smiled at the determination in his voice. "That sounds like a lifetime's work." Luke looked at the daguerreotype one more time, studying his father's face and the wolves that had trusted him enough to pose for a permanent record of their partnership. Thomas Donovan had been forced to choose between love and survival. But perhaps his son could find a way to choose both. "Then we'd better get started," Luke said, carefully replacing the precious items in their protective box. The storm was ending, and the journey toward his father's sanctuary was about to become something larger, a mission to restore what government persecution had destroyed, and to honor a legacy that had been waiting 30 years for someone willing to reclaim it. Armed with his father's maps and a purpose that transcended simple survival, Luke led their small group deeper into the mountains than any of them had ever traveled. The terrain grew increasingly rugged with each mile, but Thomas Donovan's careful notations proved invaluable. Every marked water source was exactly where indicated. Every trail junction matched the hand-drawn details. Every potential shelter existed as documented. But it was the hidden cave system that would determine whether their desperate flight could become something more permanent. According to his father's most detailed map, tucked between the pages of the journal like a treasured secret, there existed a network of interconnected caves in the heart of the mountain range. Thomas had labeled it simply the Sanctuary, with notes indicating year-round water, multiple entrances, and enough space to support a substantial wolf population. The map showed careful thought behind its creation. Thomas had marked not just the caves themselves, but approach routes that would be invisible to casual observers, defensive positions that could be monitored from within the cave system, and escape routes that led to 3 different valleys if retreat became necessary. Luke studied the map each evening as they made camp, cross-referencing it with the terrain they'd covered and the challenges that still lay ahead. The sanctuary was still 2 days away, through increasingly difficult country, but the wolves seemed to sense their destination. Storm had begun ranging ahead with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested inherited memory of these trails. It was Martha who first noticed they were being followed. Her teacher's instincts, honed by years of monitoring children's behavior, picked up the subtle signs of human pursuit that Luke's focus on navigation had missed. "We have company," she said quietly on their fourth morning, nodding toward a ridge they'd crossed the previous day. Smoke from a campfire was barely visible against the dawn sky, but it was there too small for a hunting party, too large for a single traveler. Luke studied the distant smoke through his field glasses, counting the implications of discovery, this deep in the mountains. Government agents following them this far meant the stakes had escalated beyond simple territorial law enforcement. This was now a federal matter, with resources behind it that could sustain pursuit indefinitely. "How many do you think?" Martha asked. "Hard to say, but they're moving faster than us, which means they're traveling light and they know where we're going." The second possibility was more troubling than the first. If their pursuers knew about Thomas Donovan's sanctuary, then Luke's father's secret had been compromised for decades. The hidden refuge might already be occupied by the very forces they were trying to escape. But Storm's behavior suggested otherwise. The pack leader had become increasingly confident as they approached the sanctuary area, moving with the kind of territorial certainty that indicated safe ground ahead. If government agents controlled the caves, the wolves would sense the danger long before human senses detected it. Luke made the decision to push harder toward their destination, despite the risks of exhausting the wolves or missing crucial details in his father's navigation notes. Better to reach the sanctuary with pursuit close behind than to be caught in open country with no defensive options. The forced pace took its toll on everyone. Scout, despite his youthful energy, began to lag behind the main group. Shadow's old injuries created stiffness that slowed his movement over rough terrain. Even Storm showed signs of fatigue, though the pack leader's determination never wavered. It was Martha who kept them moving when Luke's own resolve began to falter. Her presence had become essential to the group's morale, not just Luke's, but the wolves as well. Scout had formed a particular attachment to her, while the others seemed to view her as an integral part of their extended pack structure. "Your father chose well when he mapped this route," Martha said as they negotiated a particularly challenging passage between towering rock formations. "I can see why government agents would have trouble following these trails." Luke nodded, though privately he worried about the map's age. 30 years of weather and geological changes could have altered crucial details, made passable routes impassable, or created new hazards that Donovan couldn't have anticipated. But as they climbed higher into terrain that felt increasingly primordial, Luke began to understand why his father had chosen this area for the sanctuary. The mountains here were not just remote, they were actively hostile to human intrusion. Natural barriers channeled movement along specific routes, creating bottlenecks that could be easily defended and passages that could be hidden from anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The wolves' behavior changed again as they approached the final approach to the sanctuary. All 5 animals became more alert, more focused, as if they were nearing something significant. Storm began making soft vocalizations that Luke had never heard before, not quite howls, but something that carried meaning for the other pack members. "They know," Martha said, watching the wolves' increased activity. "Somehow they remember this place." Luke felt a chill of recognition as Storm led them along a narrow ledge that matched perfectly with his father's detailed drawings. The pack leader wasn't just following familiar territory, he was coming home to a place his ancestors had known for generations. The entrance to the cave system was almost invisible until you were standing directly in front of it. Thomas Donovan had chosen his sanctuary well, a narrow opening hidden behind a curtain of hanging vegetation, positioned so that it appeared to be nothing more than a shadow in the rock face unless approached from exactly the right angle. Storm paused at the entrance, turning back to look at Luke with an expression that seemed to ask permission to proceed. The formality of the gesture struck Luke as significant. The wolf was acknowledging that this territory belonged to the Donovan family, even though wolves had used it for decades. "Go ahead," Luke said quietly. It's yours as much as mine. Storm disappeared into the cave opening, followed quickly by the other four wolves. Their excited vocalizations echoed from within the cave system, suggesting spaces large enough to accommodate sound without the claustrophobic dampening that characterized smaller refuges. Luke and Martha followed, leading their horses carefully through the entrance passage. What they found inside exceeded even Thomas Donovan's careful descriptions. The cave system was vast, with multiple chambers connected by natural passages that created an underground network stretching deep into the mountain. More importantly, the caves showed evidence of recent wolf occupation. Old bedding areas, scattered bones from successful hunts, and the lingering scent markers that indicated this place had been used as intended as a sanctuary for wolves driven from lower territories by human persecution. "Your father knew what he was doing," Martha said as she explored one of the larger chambers. "This place could support dozens of wolves through the worst weather." Luke found his father's final cache in the deepest chamber, marked by stone cairns that matched notations on the secret map. Thomas had left supplies that were still useful after 30 years: tools, medical supplies, and detailed instructions for managing the sanctuary that revealed the full scope of his vision. The written instructions showed that Thomas Donovan hadn't just created a hiding place. He'd designed a sustainable refuge where wolves could establish permanent territories beyond government reach. He'd mapped hunting grounds in adjacent valleys, identified seasonal migration routes that avoided human settlements, and even established supply caches for humans who might need to support the sanctuary's operations. But the most significant discovery was a letter addressed to my son, should he choose to continue this work. Thomas had somehow known that Luke might one day find himself in the same position, forced to choose between abandoning wolves or abandoning conventional human society. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "then the wolves have found you as I hoped they would. They carry memories in their blood, Luke, memories of humans who can be trusted. Humans who understand that some partnerships transcend the boundaries our laws try to impose." The letter went on to detail not just the sanctuary's operations, but Thomas Donovan's vision for a network of refuges that could preserve wolf populations throughout the territory. It was ambitious, dangerous, and exactly what Luke had begun to envision during their journey into the mountains. But as Luke finished reading his father's letter, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the canyon below the cave entrance. Their pursuers had found them, and the sanctuary that had protected wolves for 30 years was about to face its greatest test. Storm's warning growl from the cave entrance confirmed what Luke already knew: the peaceful phase of their journey was over. Everything that happened next would determine not just their survival, but whether Thomas Donovan's vision of coexistence between humans and wolves could survive into the next generation. Luke folded his father's letter and placed it carefully in his jacket pocket, next to the government telegram that had started their flight into the mountains. The two documents represented opposing visions of the future, one based on systematic elimination of anything that complicated economic development, the other based on the belief that wilderness and civilization could coexist if humans chose cooperation over domination. As the sound of horses grew closer, Luke realized that the next few hours would determine which vision would prevail in this remote corner of Montana territory. The sanctuary his father had built was about to face its ultimate test, and Luke Donovan was about to discover what he was truly capable of when everything he cared about was threatened. The hunting horn was among the last items Luke found in his father's cache, wrapped in oiled leather beneath layers of carefully preserved supplies. Made from a buffalo horn and worn smooth by years of use, it bore the distinctive spiral carving that Thomas Donovan had added during long winter evenings at the ranch. Luke remembered that horn from his childhood, though he'd never understood its true purpose until this moment. According to his father's notes, the horn served as a communication device with the wolves. Different combinations of notes conveyed specific meanings that the pack had learned to recognize over years of partnership. It was, Thomas had written, the voice that calls them home when all else fails. Luke had no time to master the complex signals his father had developed. The approaching riders were less than an hour away, their voices carrying clearly through the mountain air as they coordinated their assault on the sanctuary. But he could see in Storm's reaction to the horn's presence that the great wolf recognized its significance, even after 30 years. From their position within the cave entrance, Luke counted at least 8 mounted men making their way up the narrow canyon that led to the sanctuary. Colonel Morrison rode in the lead, his military bearing unmistakable even at distance. Behind him came federal marshals, armed with the kind of weaponry that made resistance seem impossible. But Luke's modified rifle was useless for defense, and Martha carried only a small pistol more suited to discouraging coyotes than stopping determined federal agents. Their only advantages were the defensible position of the cave and the wolves' intimate knowledge of terrain the government men had never seen. "They don't know about the other entrances," Martha said, studying his father's map by lamplight. Thomas marked 3 different ways in and out of this system. Luke nodded, formulating a desperate plan that depended entirely on the wolves' willingness to trust him with their lives. If Storm and the others would follow his lead, they might escape through the network of passages Thomas had mapped decades earlier. But it would require coordination between humans and wolves that had never been tested in life-or-death circumstances. The sound of approaching horses stopped at the canyon's narrowest point, perhaps 200 yards below the cave entrance. Luke could hear Colonel Morrison's voice clearly as he organized his men for what he obviously expected to be a simple capture operation. "Donovan!" Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You're trapped up there with nowhere to run. Come out peacefully, and we'll consider this a misunderstanding rather than treason." Luke remained silent, knowing that any response would simply confirm their exact location. Morrison's men were already spreading out to cover potential escape routes, but they were looking for conventional human hiding places rather than the complex cave system. Thomas had chosen specifically for its defensive advantages. It was Storm who took the initiative that changed everything. The pack leader moved to Luke's side and gently took the hunting horn in his jaws, carrying it to the cave entrance where the sound would carry clearly into the canyon below. The wolf's intentions were unmistakable. He was ready to announce their presence on his own terms. Luke understood immediately. The horn wouldn't just communicate with the wolves, it would serve as a declaration that this sanctuary belonged to creatures who had every right to defend their territory from intruders. Storm was ready to make their stand. "All right," Luke said quietly, taking the horn from Storm's gentle grip. "Let's show them what they're really dealing with." The first blast from Thomas Donovan's hunting horn shattered the morning stillness with a sound that seemed to emerge from the mountain itself. The note was deep, resonant, carrying 30 years of accumulated meaning for any wolf within miles of the sanctuary. Luke didn't know the specific signals his father had developed, but he understood the horn's fundamental message: the sanctuary was occupied by those who belonged there. Storm's response was immediate and magnificent. The great wolf lifted his head and howled with a voice that seemed to carry the authority of every wolf who had ever called these mountains home. The sound echoed from the canyon walls, amplified and enriched until it became something larger than any single animal could produce. Dawn and Ember joined their voices to Storm's, followed by Shadow and finally Scout, whose young voice added a note of defiance that made Luke's throat tighten with pride. The combined howl was haunting, powerful, and absolutely unmistakable in its message. This territory was defended by creatures who would not yield to human authority. The effect on Morrison's men was immediate and unsettling. Luke could see horses dancing nervously as their riders struggled to maintain control. Several of the federal agents drew their weapons, but they were aiming at sounds rather than visible targets, creating a tableau of men uncomfortable with an enemy they couldn't clearly see or understand. "Fascinating," Martha murmured, watching the scene unfold below. "They came prepared to arrest a man and some wolves, but they're facing something much older." Luke understood what she meant. The horn and the wolves' response had transformed their situation from a simple law enforcement action into something that touched on deeper conflicts between wilderness and civilization, between creatures fighting for survival and humans determined to impose their will on the natural world. Morrison's voice rose again, but this time with less confidence. "Donovan, you're only making this worse for yourself. Come down now and we can discuss terms." Luke raised the horn again, producing a different combination of notes, longer, more complex, with pauses that seemed to carry their own meaning. He had no idea if he was communicating anything specific, but Storm's alert response suggested the signals weren't random noise to wolves who carried inherited memories of what such sounds meant. This time, Storm's answering howl was joined by voices from outside the cave system, distant responses that indicated other wolves in the area, survivors who had been hiding in remote territories until the horn's call brought them to the sanctuary's defense. The realization hit Morrison's men like a physical blow. They had come to capture 5 wolves and 2 humans, but they were now surrounded by an unknown number of predators who knew this terrain intimately and had every reason to consider the federal agents intruders in their territory. Luke watched one of the marshals lean over to speak urgently with Morrison, pointing to high ridges where movement could be glimpsed among the trees. The colonel's confident bearing began to show cracks as he realized his carefully planned operation was becoming something much more complex and dangerous. But Luke knew the wolves' apparent numbers were deceiving. The sanctuary had attracted survivors from across the territory, but they were all desperate refugees rather than a coordinated pack. The horn had called them to defend their last safe place, but they had no battle plan beyond the courage that desperation had given them. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, with neither side willing to make the first aggressive move, but Scout changed the dynamic in a way that no one expected. The young wolf had been listening to the horn calls and the responding howls with obvious excitement. And suddenly he bolted from the cave entrance, racing down the canyon slope toward Morrison's men. Luke's heart stopped as he watched Scout charge directly toward armed federal agents who would shoot without hesitation. The young wolf was moving too fast for any command to reach him, too committed to his course for any hope of recall. But Scout wasn't attacking the federal agents, he was racing toward something else entirely. Luke followed the young wolf's trajectory and saw what had captured Scout's attention. A lone horse standing riderless near a cluster of rocks, apparently abandoned by a federal agent who had dismounted to take a better position. Scout reached the horse and began circling it with obvious agitation, not threatening the animal, but clearly trying to communicate something urgent. Luke raised his field glasses and studied the scene more carefully, finally understanding what Scout had discovered. The horse wore the distinctive marking of the rustling operation Luke had uncovered near the Yellowstone River. One of Morrison's federal agents was actually part of the criminal conspiracy that had been used to justify the wolf elimination program. Luke raised the hunting horn one more time, producing a series of short, sharp blasts that seemed to galvanize every wolf within hearing. Storm immediately understood the signal's urgency and began moving toward the cave's rear entrance, leading Dawn and Ember toward the escape routes Thomas Donovan had mapped for exactly this kind of emergency. The final confrontation was about to begin, but it would be fought on terms that none of them had anticipated. Scout's discovery had transformed their desperate flight into something that might expose the corruption behind the entire wolf elimination program, if they could survive long enough to reveal what they'd learned. The federal agents moved with military precision, but they were operating in terrain that favored defenders who knew every passage and hiding place. Luke led Martha and the wolves through Thomas Donovan's carefully mapped escape routes as gunfire echoed from the canyon below, the sound of Scout's discovery triggering the confrontation everyone had hoped to avoid. Luke's blood-stained bandana had started the morning as a simple piece of cloth tucked into his jacket pocket. Now it served as an impromptu bandage around a graze on his forearm, where a ricocheting bullet had found its mark during their desperate flight through the cave system's narrowest passages. The wound wasn't serious, but the blood on the blue fabric served as a stark reminder of how quickly their situation had deteriorated. Scout had rejoined them after his bold reconnaissance, but the young wolf's discovery of the rustling connection had transformed Colonel Morrison's methodical capture operation into something approaching a military assault. The federal agents could no longer afford to take prisoners who might expose the corruption behind the wolf elimination program. "This way," Luke said, consulting his father's map by the dim light filtering through cracks in the cave ceiling. The passage ahead looked impossibly narrow, but Thomas had marked it as passable for both humans and wolves, leading to an exit that would place them miles from their original position. Martha squeezed through the narrow opening first, her teacher's practicality serving her well in the confined spaces. The wolves followed, with the fluid grace of creatures designed for difficult terrain. But Luke struggled with the pack, containing his father's documents and supplies essential for their survival. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Morrison's men had found the cave system's main entrance and were following with the kind of determination that suggested they understood exactly what was at stake. This was no longer about territorial law enforcement. It was about preventing exposure of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal authority. Luke's wounded arm protested as he dragged himself through the narrow passage, but the pain helped him focus on immediate necessities rather than the larger implications of their situation. Each foot of progress took them deeper into the mountain's interior, following routes that Thomas Donovan had mapped during years of patient exploration. The passage opened into a larger chamber where ancient wolf dens had been carved into the rock by generations of occupants. Storm moved immediately to one of the den sites, sniffing carefully at stone that held the scent memories of countless wolves who had found safety in this hidden sanctuary. "They're not just hiding places," Martha observed as she examined the den sites. "They're generational homes. Wolves have been raising families here for decades." Luke nodded, understanding why his father had chosen this location for the sanctuary's heart. The chamber represented continuity, proof that wolves could establish permanent territories in places where humans chose to coexist rather than eliminate. But it also represented what would be lost if Morrison's men succeeded in their mission. The sound of voices echoed from the passage they'd just navigated, closer than Luke had expected. Morrison's federal agents were moving faster through the cave system than the terrain should have allowed, suggesting they had better maps than Luke had anticipated. "They know about these caves," Martha said, reaching the same conclusion. "Someone's been here before." Luke felt a chill of understanding. The conspiracy between territorial officials and rustling operations was larger than simple cattle theft. Someone had been systematically mapping and compromising every refuge where wolves might survive, preparing for a final elimination campaign that would leave no sanctuary beyond government reach. But Storm's behavior suggested the wolves had advantages their pursuers didn't understand. The pack leader was moving with increasing confidence as they progressed deeper into the cave system, following scent trails and territorial markers that guided him toward exits Luke's father had never documented. "There are more passages," Luke realized, watching Storm's purposeful movement. Dad only mapped the ones he used. The wolves know routes he never found. Storm led them through a series of connections so complex that Luke lost track of their direction entirely. The passages wound through natural formations that seemed designed to confuse anyone unfamiliar with their logic, creating a labyrinth that would challenge even experienced trackers. It was in the deepest part of this maze that Luke made his second crucial discovery. Hidden in a chamber that showed no signs of his father's presence, he found evidence that other humans had been working to protect wolves long before Thomas Donovan established his sanctuary. Ancient pictographs covered the chamber walls, depicting partnerships between humans and wolves that dated back centuries. The images showed hunting cooperation, territorial agreements, and mutual defense arrangements that suggested Luke's family's connection to wolves was part of a much older tradition. Martha studied the pictographs with her educator's eye for detail. These aren't random drawings. They're records, documentation of successful relationships between humans and wolves going back generations. Luke traced one of the images with his finger, a human figure and a wolf standing together before what appeared to be a cave entrance, both facing outward towards some common threat. The composition suggested not just cooperation, but genuine partnership between species that government policy now classified as irreconcilable enemies. But the sound of approaching pursuit forced them to abandon their archaeological discovery. Morrison's men had followed their trail through the complex passage system, moving with a speed that suggested professional tracking experience. Luke wrapped his bleeding arm more tightly with the bandana and prepared to continue their flight through terrain that was becoming increasingly vertical. The final passage led upward through a natural chimney that opened onto a hidden ledge high above the canyon where Morrison's men had first cornered them. The climb was treacherous, especially for the wounded Luke, but the wolves moved with confidence that suggested they'd used this route before. Luke emerged onto the ledge to find himself looking down at the federal agents' camp from a position that revealed the true scope of their operation. Morrison had brought more than 8 men. Luke counted at least 20 horses and supply wagons that indicated a sustained campaign rather than a simple arrest operation. More troubling was the evidence of coordination with the rustling operation Scout had discovered. Several of the horses bore the brands Luke recognized from his investigation near the Yellowstone River, confirming that the cattle theft conspiracy extended directly into federal law enforcement. "They're not just eliminating wolves," Martha said, studying the scene below. "They're eliminating anyone who might expose their broader operations." Luke realized their situation had evolved beyond anything he'd anticipated. Morrison's men weren't pursuing them to enforce territorial law. They were conducting an elimination operation designed to remove witnesses to systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of government authority. But the ledge where they'd taken refuge offered something Luke hadn't expected: a view of the broader landscape that revealed other smoke columns rising from distant valleys. The horn calls and wolf howls that had marked their confrontation with Morrison's men had apparently triggered responses from survivors across the territory. Storm noticed the distant signals as well, lifting his head to howl a response that echoed across miles of mountain terrain. The sound was answered by voices from multiple directions, creating a network of communication that spanned the entire region. "There are more of them," Luke said with growing understanding. "Wolves, but also people who've been protecting them. Dad's sanctuary was part of something bigger." The blood-stained bandana around Luke's arm had darkened as their climb progressed, but the wound seemed to be clotting properly. More importantly, the visible evidence of their struggle seemed to have galvanized Martha's determination to see their mission through to completion. "We can't keep running forever," she said, studying Thomas Donovan's maps in the afternoon light. "Eventually, we have to stand and fight." Luke looked at his 5 wolves, Storm alert and confident, Dawn and Ember watchful but ready, Shadow maintaining his careful distance but clearly committed to the group, and Scout, whose discovery had revealed the true stakes of their conflict. Below them, Morrison's men were organizing for a final assault on the sanctuary that had protected wolves for 30 years. Above them, the high country offered escape routes that might lead to temporary safety, but no permanent solution. Luke made his decision with the clarity that comes from understanding that some fights are worth whatever they cost. He unwrapped the bandana from his wounded arm and tied it to a branch where the wind would carry it like a banner, a signal that the sanctuary was defended by those who would not yield to corruption disguised as authority. The final confrontation was about to begin, but it would be fought by people and wolves who understood that some partnerships transcend any government's power to destroy them. 6 months later, Luke Donovan sat in the morning sunlight, outside a cabin he'd built with his own hands, writing in a new leather journal that chronicled a life he could never have imagined when he first found 5 dying wolves by the Yellowstone River. The old journal, filled with 15 years of departures and endings, rested in a place of honor on the cabin's mantel. But this new book told a different story, one of arrivals and beginnings that had grown from the most unlikely of partnerships. The cabin stood in a valley that didn't appear on any government map, accessible only through passages that Thomas Donovan had discovered decades earlier and that the wolves had refined through generations of use. Here, beyond the reach of territorial authority and federal jurisdiction, a small community had taken root around principles that would have seemed impossible in the world Luke had left behind. Storm lay in the shade nearby, his silver coat gleaming with health and contentment. The great wolf had become more than a companion, he was a partner in the truest sense, helping to guide and protect a growing population of wolves that had found refuge in the hidden valleys. Dawn and Ember had established their own den sites, raising pups that represented hope for species survival that government policy had tried to eliminate entirely. Shadow had overcome his wariness of human contact, though he maintained the dignified reserve that Luke had come to respect as essential to the wolf's character. Even Scout, now fully grown and confident, served as an ambassador between the human and wolf communities that shared the sanctuary's resources. Martha Henderson, now Martha Donovan, after a simple ceremony conducted under the open sky with wolves, as witnesses had established a school for the children of families who'd chosen sanctuary life over conventional society. Her students included not just human children, but young wolves, whose education emphasized cooperation between species that the outside world considered natural enemies. The community that had grown around Thomas Donovan's original sanctuary included 12 families, all people who'd found themselves in conflict with policies that prioritized economic development over sustainable coexistence with wildlife. They were ranchers who'd refused to poison wolves, traders who'd been bankrupted by government contracts awarded to Russell's criminal network, and government employees who'd been fired for refusing to participate in systematic corruption. Luke's new journal documented the practical details of building a society that functioned according to different principles than those governing the territories beyond the mountains. It was a record of experimentation and adaptation, of learning to balance human needs with wildlife conservation, of discovering that prosperity didn't require the elimination of everything that complicated short-term profits. The entry he was writing this morning described the arrival of 2 new families seeking sanctuary refugees from Morrison's continuing campaign to eliminate anyone who might testify about the connections between territorial officials and criminal operations. The Colonel's assault on the original sanctuary had failed catastrophically when Luke's evidence of the rustling conspiracy reached sympathetic journalists in distant cities, but Morrison's response had been to escalate rather than retreat. News from the outside continues to confirm that our choice was the right one, Luke wrote. The territorial government has declared our entire region lawless territory, to justify military operations that are really designed to eliminate witnesses to corruption. But they can't find what they can't reach, and the sanctuary protocols Dad developed have proven more effective than he ever imagined. The protocols Thomas Donovan had established were indeed proving their worth. The sanctuary operated as a network of interconnected communities, each self-sufficient, but all coordinated through communication systems that the wolves had helped develop. Messages traveled along routes that only the wolves knew completely, creating an information network that government agents couldn't penetrate or disrupt. More importantly, the sanctuary communities were proving that human-wolf coexistence was not just possible but beneficial to both species. The wolves' presence had eliminated traditional predator problems. Their territorial behaviors had reduced conflicts with neighboring wildlife, and their hunting patterns had actually improved the health of local deer and elk populations. Luke looked up from his journal as Martha emerged from their cabin, followed by two wolf pups who'd been orphaned during government elimination campaigns and raised by human families in the sanctuary. The pups, named Hope and Future, by the children who'd helped care for them, represented something that bureaucrats in distant offices would never understand: the possibility of relationships based on mutual respect rather than domination. "Morning, love," Martha said, settling beside Luke on the wooden bench he'd carved from deadfall timber. "What are you recording today?" Luke showed her the journal entry describing the new arrivals. Tom Bradley sent word through the network. 2 more families forced out of the territory for refusing to participate in Morrison's operations. Martha nodded sadly. Sheriff Bradley had become an unofficial coordinator for people seeking sanctuary, using his position to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, while carefully gathering evidence of territorial corruption. His report suggested that Morrison's campaign was creating more refugees than it was eliminating. "Any word about the federal investigation?" Martha asked. Luke smiled at the question that had become part of their morning routine. "Still ongoing, but the newspaper stories are having an effect. Morrison's been reassigned to desk duty while they sort through the evidence we provided." The evidence Luke had gathered about the rustling conspiracy had indeed reached sympathetic audiences in cities where territorial politics carried less influence. Newspaper stories about systematic corruption in Montana Territory had prompted federal investigations that Morrison's political allies couldn't suppress indefinitely. But Luke no longer cared about vindication or justice in the conventional sense. The sanctuary had become something more valuable than revenge against corrupt officials. It had become proof that alternative ways of living were not just possible but preferable for people willing to prioritize cooperation over competition. Storm lifted his head as the sound of approaching horses reached the valley. Luke tensed automatically, but the great wolf's relaxed posture indicated friendly visitors rather than threats. Only people guided by sanctuary wolves could find this hidden community, which made unexpected arrivals impossible rather than simply unlikely. The riders who emerged from the tree line were Tom Bradley and his wife Sarah, making their monthly supply run to the sanctuary communities. Bradley had become an essential link between the hidden valleys and the outside world, trading sanctuary-produced goods for manufactured items the communities couldn't produce themselves. "Morning, Luke." "Martha," Bradley called as he dismounted. "Brought letters from the newspaper folks and some interesting news from Washington." The letters were from journalists who'd been investigating the territorial corruption story, requesting additional details and documentation for articles that would expose the full scope of systematic wildlife elimination policies. Luke's evidence had become the foundation for a national conversation about government overreach and environmental destruction. But it was Bradley's news from Washington that changed everything. "Word came through official channels yesterday," the sheriff said as he unloaded supplies from his pack animals. "Colonel Morrison's been arrested on federal charges. Seems your rustling evidence was just the beginning of what investigators found when they started looking closely at territorial operations." Luke felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd carried for months. Morrison's arrest meant the immediate threat to sanctuary communities had been eliminated, though it would be years before the full scope of territorial corruption was exposed and corrected. More importantly, it meant the wolves could begin expanding their territories beyond the hidden valleys, reclaiming ranges that systematic poisoning had made uninhabitable. The sanctuary would continue to serve as a refuge, but it no longer needed to be a prison for creatures whose only crime was existing in territories that humans wanted to exploit. As Bradley and Sarah shared lunch with the sanctuary community, Luke found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him from isolated drifter to community leader. The transformation had begun with a simple decision to help dying wolves, but it had grown into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between civilization and wilderness. "You know what I think about most?" Martha asked as they walked together through the valley where their neighbors' children played safely alongside young wolves. "What's that? Your father would be proud." not just of what you've accomplished, but of what you've chosen to become. Luke looked around at the community that had grown from Thomas Donovan's vision and his own willingness to honor commitments that transcended personal convenience. Children laughed, while wolf pups tumbled around their feet. Adults worked together on projects that benefited both human and wolf families. Elders shared stories that preserved knowledge of cooperation between species that bureaucrats had tried to declare impossible. "I think he'd be surprised by how well it's worked," Luke said. "But maybe that's the lesson: the impossible becomes possible when people choose to make it work." That evening, as Luke made his final journal entry of the day, he wrote about the difference between surviving and living, between avoiding loss and accepting responsibility for something larger than personal safety. The wolves, sleeping peacefully around his cabin, had taught him that strength came not from isolation, but from the willingness to form bonds that transcended species boundaries. "The old journal recorded departures," he wrote. "This one records arrivals, wolves finding sanctuary, families finding community, and all of us finding that the world can be different when people choose to make it different. Tomorrow we'll begin expanding the territory, reclaiming ranges the government thought they'd eliminated forever. The wolves are going home." Luke closed the new journal and looked out at stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Storm raised his head from where he'd been resting, meeting Luke's eyes with the same steady intelligence that had first convinced a lonely cowboy to stay beside a river instead of riding away from creatures that needed his help. The great wolf's expression seemed to hold acknowledgement of the journey they'd completed together, from desperate survival to thriving community, from government persecution to federal protection, from isolation to belonging. Storm had taught Luke that some partnerships transcended any authority's power to destroy them, and Luke had proven worthy of that trust. In the distance, other wolves began their evening songs, voices that had been silent in these valleys for decades before the sanctuary restored their rightful place. The sound no longer carried desperation or defiance, but simply the contentment of creatures secure in territory they could claim as home. Martha appeared in the cabin doorway, lamplight silhouetting her figure against the warm glow within. "Coming inside?" she asked softly. Luke stood, stretching muscles that had grown accustomed to honest work rather than constant travel. In a minute, just listening to them settle in for the night. The wolf songs continued, a chorus that spoke of territories reclaimed, families reunited, and futures that extended beyond mere survival. It was the sound of hope made audible, of government policies overturned by the simple persistence of creatures that refused to accept elimination as inevitable. Luke picked up his new journal and walked toward the cabin he'd built with his own hands, in a valley that didn't appear on any official map, surrounded by wolves that bureaucrats had declared extinct. Behind him, Storm followed with the quiet confidence of a creature that had found his place in a world that finally had room for partnerships between species that chose cooperation over domination. The old leather journal that chronicled 15 years of departures would remain on the mantle as a reminder of where Luke had come from. But the new journal would grow thick with entries about arrivals, about community, about the daily miracles that occurred when people chose to make space for creatures that enriched rather than threatened their lives. As Luke reached the cabin's threshold, he turned back one final time to look at the valley that had become home to both wolves and humans. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, expanding territories, welcoming more refugees, continuing the work of proving that coexistence was possible when people chose to make it possible. But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of wolves settling peacefully into territory they could claim as their own, Luke Donovan understood that some journeys end not with departure, but with the recognition that you finally arrived where you always belonged. The wolves had found their sanctuary, and in protecting them, Luke had found his own.